into the what's become known as the administrative scheme for on the runs. So you have either the honour or the disadvantage of being our first witness. But thank you very much for joining us. We've got a number of areas we want to explore, a number of questions we want to ask, but it was agreed that I should kick off really with, I suppose, a question trying to determine exactly what we're dealing with here, what we're actually looking at. The term on the runs really seems to be at the centre of the whole thing. Could you tell us what we are to understand by the term on the runs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the invitation to come before your committee this afternoon. I would like to put in record this committee is the first body who has approached either myself or other members of the police to explain the process that went on within Operation Rapid, and I think it's a very good opportunity for me to explain what has been in the public domain for some time. In respect of on the runs, in late 2006, early 2007, I was first introduced to the issue of people who had voluntarily exiled themselves from the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, commonly now known as on the runs. And this was part of an internal police service discussion and requirement following meetings at a senior level between government officials and my Assistant Chief Constable and the Chief Constable. As my role, part of my role as head of Serious Crime Branch was to review individuals who have been identified as being on the run. The on the runs were, by and large, a list of people supplied intermittently to the Assistant Chief Constable's office who believed they were wanted or suspected of offences within Northern Ireland. Some of those people were unknown to the police. Some of them were actually living in the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom or in Northern Ireland and were clearly not exiled from Northern Ireland. Others were persons who had been circulated as wanted and who, following a review of evidence and intelligence to the standard of 2007 following the Human Rights Act, were deemed to be no longer wanted, and then a final body of people who were still deemed by the PSNI to be wanted. So that's the collective group of who the on the runs were.
When we talk about on the runs, does that also include people who escaped from prisons? And
that's correct. A number of people on the list had either not returned following bail or who had escaped.
So you wouldn't be called an on the run unless you were running away from something?
I like to use the term that they had voluntarily exiled themselves, because some of them were not wanted by the police. Some of them had, for whatever reason, formed the view that they were wanted.
So if I could just explore this a little bit further. Circumstances are different in Northern Ireland. Is there then a separate category of people who are called on the runs? And if so, why is there a separate category of people? There wouldn't be in England, for example.
No, there is no category within the police systems known as on the runs. There are people who are circulated as wanted by the police. The reason that these people are termed on the runs or were treated within Operation Rapid was because they have been identified by the British government to the Chief Constable as people who the Chief Constable was required to check if they were still wanted.
And who had identified them to the Chief Constable?
My understanding was that a solicitor, Mr McGrory, was writing to the Chief Constable. I now find out from the judgment that wasn't the case, that names were being supplied by the Northern Ireland office to the Chief Constable. So
it's coming from the Northern Ireland office,
yes,
to the Chief Constable, not from a political party, whichever that may be, to the Chief Constable?
Well, from Mr Justice Sweeney's judgment, it appears that Sinn Féin were providing names to the Northern Ireland office who were passing to the Chief Constable.
And also, you read the Downey judgment. Had you believed otherwise?
I believed that the requirement was coming from letters from Mr McGrory representing his clients.
And was Mr McGrory at that stage representing all, or did he hold himself out to be representing all OTRs?
I never met Mr McGrory, although Mr Sheridan did. So I can't answer that question.
Right, we'll keep that one for Mr. Sheridan then.
Can I just ask members, because obviously we're at the very beginning and we've a lot of questions, if you could catch my eye, please. We'll try and keep some semblance of order. Right, Naomi.
Could I maybe just pursue that point a little further with you? First of all, can I check, you submitted on paper a document to the committee to help us understand the background. Are you happy for me to refer to that document in
I am
question?
indeed, yes.
Okay. And I could ask you on page 2, first paragraph, you said in serious crime branch, it was your delegated responsibility to review those wanted for serious crime and to ensure the persons circulated as wanted persons are indeed persons against whom the police have intelligence of sufficient grading, basically to keep them on that list.
That's correct.
Is that something that was done routinely for everyone who fell into that category? Or was Operation Rapid purely dealing with those who were brought to your attention seeking clarification? That's my first question.
Well, in answer to that, we have a statutory responsibility to ensure that we investigate crime efficiently and effectively, and part of that is to constantly review wanted persons, and there is an ongoing review of wanted persons conducted by PSNI, and the reason that that's in that paragraph is because I wanted to make it quite clear that in doing this, that I was doing it as part of the normal policing role, although the only difference was that these names were raised independent of the normal internal PSNI reviews, which are frequently carried out.
And can I then go on to ask, if this is part of the normal role, would you routinely contact people who are on that list to tell them they've been taken off that list?
No.
Would you normally refer those individuals to someone else in order for them to tell them that?
No.
So this wasn't routine in the sense that these particular individuals who were brought to the Chief Constable and then you were asked to do this assessment as part of Operation Rapid were receiving information that routinely would not have been made to other people who were removed from the wanted list?
Well, in answer to that, and I did struggle with that at the time, my understanding from legal advice is that under Article 3, a citizen is entitled to know if they request from the state, if the state wants them for any offence. Therefore, when a request was made by these individuals, we were led to believe that it was our statutory responsibility to respond in some form.
Okay. And further to that, when people were referred, it's already been referenced by Kate Hoey that some of these people had escaped from custody, either through not returning if they were released on bail or through escaping from the prison system. Are you aware that anyone in that category would have received a letter to say they were no longer wanted, given that you're either in custody or not in custody, and if you have been in custody and you've evaded custody, you're clearly in breach?
Well, I would like to state at this point that the police did not send any letters.
No, I understand
Okay.
that.
Most certainly, anyone who we identified on the run was not recommended not to be circulated.
Okay.
They remain circulated.
Okay. So those in that category of individual would not have been people who you would have been removing as part of Operation Rapid from your list of wanted persons?
Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you.
Ian.
Thank you. Baxter, it's good to see you in front of the committee. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a couple of questions? You said something very, very interesting in your opening remark. You said that this was the first opportunity that you had to actually speak publicly or to give evidence about, in a way, about this case. Could I ask you, you'll know that the Downey case was adjourned in December, so that the prosecution could get additional evidence. Are you telling us that the prosecution didn't come to you, speak to you, that they didn't seek additional evidence from you, clarification from you, and that were you given any access to the material that the prosecution held so that you could be of assistance in the process of law?
The answer to that is quite clear, no. I did receive a phone call from an Inspector Corrigan who was doing some disclosure work for the prosecution in London in relation to documents. In those conversations, he clearly relayed them back because some of them are in the judgment. I did offer to Inspector Corrigan that I would willingly attend to give evidence, to explain the decisions around, in particular, the John Downey case, but I never received any such request.
So prosecution, apart from that one telephone call, didn't bother coming to the expert on this case? I mean, you've been in prosecution cases yourself many times in your experience as a police officer, senior police officer. Did you find that bizarre?
Well, I was quite surprised, particularly if you look at paragraph 10 of the judgment, where Mr. Justice Sweeney adjourned the hearing to enable investigations to be conducted. And I would have to say at this stage, Mr. Chairman, that, and I want to be careful what I say here, but I don't believe the investigations were conducted thoroughly, because clearly in the disclosure process, documents from the government, and in particular the Attorney General's office, were not submitted to Mr. Justice Sweeney. And in particular, I would refer to a meeting which took place on the 9th of June 2006. If I could be given an opportunity to refer to it. At that meeting, between representatives of the PSNI, the Home Office, and the Attorney General's office, a discussion was taken. A discussion occurred around who would look at people who committed offences in England or outside the Northern Ireland jurisdiction. It was very interesting. A lady, Mrs. Pettifer, who represented the Home Office, said it would not be appropriate for the Home Office to ask the Metropolitan Police if anyone was wanted. I happen to agree with that. The PSNI at that meeting was concerned about their role in asking the Metropolitan, but most importantly, Mr. McGuinty said that the duty to check in England would fall to the Attorney General's office, and action 4 of that meeting was that Mr. McGuinty was to confirm with the Metropolitan Police if individuals are wanted, why they are wanted, and what evidence exists in relation to this incident. There is a legal basis for that. The PSNI operate under the Police Act 2000, which is a sole jurisdiction of Northern Ireland. I'm sure you've read in the judgment questions as to why I did not refer to Mr. Downey being wanted for the Hyde Park bombing. And I want to make quite clear that was not a mistake, it was not a catastrophic mistake, but it was a legal requirement. I have no jurisdiction, or had no jurisdiction, to pass information about a person wanted in another jurisdiction to that individual. Indeed, to do so would be prejudicing the investigation. It would be perverting the course of justice, and therefore, in those discussions in 2006, the Attorney General, who was the Attorney General for Northern Ireland and England, recognised it was their responsibility to check offences in the mainland.
So you're saying, Mr. Baxter, that it was a failure of the prosecution to do its job in the Downey case?
What I'm saying, it is a failure on two fronts. First of all, the Attorney General, despite giving an undertaking at the 9th of June 2006 meeting that they would check if people were wanted in England. Secondly, a police officer in Northern Ireland could not give details about an offender in another jurisdiction. Who would I be to pass on details to a suspect that they're wanted in another jurisdiction?
Do you think if you had been able to provide that evidence to the judge in the case, that it may have turned a different way? Well,
I think it is very important to the judge to understand that the PSNI were working within the legislation. I mean, for me to send a letter to Mr. Downey saying he was wanted in London would not only been unlawful, but would have been betraying the victims at Hyde Park.
When did you first learn that the Northern Ireland office, or that Mr. Jonathan Powell, or that other people were actually sending letters to, let me use the word, fugitives?
On the date the judgment was made public.
So that was the first time you actually learned that there was this process that resulted in a letter going?
Sorry, I'll correct my answer. The first time I knew that Mr. Downey had a letter from the Northern Ireland office was the day following his arrest, when a senior member of C2, or Serious Crime Branch, contacted me to query the origin of this letter, because the Metropolitan Police had contacted them out of bewilderment as to where it came from. In relation to an ongoing process, administrative scheme, the first time I was aware of that was the day the judgment was published.
So you, as probably the second most senior officer involved in this, only became aware that letters were going from the executive branch of government to fugitives. You became aware during the judgment, or during that process of the trial. And if that was the case, you can understand why me as a politician, why other politicians, and why the general public are so outraged that if it was a secret to you at that level, it must have been a huge secret then to the rest of us.
I would go further than that, Mr. Paisley, and say that not only was it secret, but it was not constitutional for the Northern Ireland office to be receiving material from the Attorney General, who is the independent law officer of the state, to send letters warning suspects that they were wanted in the United Kingdom.
Can I turn to the information which you did send? It's apparently is the case that Mr. Downey, who, setting aside the atrocity at Hyde Park, that his fingerprints are all over the murder of 2 gallant UDR soldiers in Enniskillen, and his fingerprints are all over the massacre at the Enniskillen bombing. Why was it the case that, in your view then, that Mr. Downey, and why material did not come from the police to say that he actually was wanted?
Well, I'm not sure that in terms of the Poppy Day bombing there's any evidence to link Mr. Downey to it. But I am aware that a fingerprint which is alleged to be from Mr. Downey was identified on a tape at the bombing of the murder of the 2 UDR officers. At the time of the review, that fingerprint could not be found in fingerprint branch. Up Rabbit took steps to notify HET, Historic Inquiry Team, whose responsibility it was to investigate historic murders. And subsequent to that, I understand the fingerprints were found in 2008. Now, the document I forwarded you for your information indicates that to have a reasonable grounds to arrest, there must be evidence that is real and in existence at the time of the arrest. And when that letter was written, or my report to Mr. Sheridan was drafted, I think, on the 10th of May, that did not exist. So therefore, on that day, Mr. Downey could not have been arrested for that offence. However, subsequent to that, when the fingerprint was found, a power of arrest, reasonable grounds.
How much later, just in terms of sequence?
Well, I understand it was about within a year it was discovered. I haven't seen the file, so I'm going by an email which I have just seen today that it was discovered in spring 2008.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I just clarify what you said, Mr. Baxter, that the letter sent to Mr. Downey did not come from the police in Northern Ireland?
No, the police sent no letters out.
No.
Our role within the legislation is to communicate with the prosecutors. So therefore, under the European Convention, it should have been the Attorney General who was responding back to a person to tell them that they were not wanted. Therefore, when we carried out our review, I reported to the Assistant Chief Constable, who sent a form of words, and in this case of Mr. Downey, it was the form of words that I had drafted. That went to the Director of Public Prosecution, who sent the letter to the Attorney General and copied that letter to Mr. Sheridan, which I have seen a copy of it. Following that, the Attorney General somehow passed that information to Northern Ireland Office. They then amended the letter, changed it, and added the sentence that he was not wanted by any police force in Northern Ireland.
So it did specifically say not wanted by any police force in Northern Ireland?
I think it's any other police forces in the judgment.
But the advice from... so they did not speak to the Metropolitan Police, presumably?
Presumably not.
Well, how can
But
Mr.
Chairman, I also find the judgment that in 2006 the Attorney General had written to Mr. Downey advising he was wanted in London, which is also very bizarre.
That he was wanted in London?
Yes, they wrote in 2006. That was a letter that we in the PSNI did not know about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
so on this point, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Baxter. Could I just ask you, just to clarify what you just said, is it my understanding that in fact that you intended, or you've told the committee, that the letter that was sent from SEC Sheridan somehow was amended at the Attorney General's office or somewhere else down the line before it went out to Mr. Downey?
Yes.
Who do you think amended it?
The Northern Ireland Office.
And why?
I presume it's the Northern Ireland Office.
Yes, you presume it's the Northern Ireland
Office. But I do not understand why the Attorney General was passing his law officer's role to the executive.
So, just picking up then from the reference to the Northern Ireland office, you will recall that when you last came before this committee, it was a completely different context, and that was the OMA inquiry in 2009, and you very kindly came to give us evidence on the 11th of November 2009. And during your evidence, I was alarmed by the fact that you had mentioned, or suggested that in fact there was tampering with the police at that stage. And I asked you to clarify what was meant by tampering. And in your reply, I'm just reaching back to your reply on the 11th of November 2009, I can assure the committee that there was an extremely unhealthy interest by officials in the Northern Ireland Office about prioritising individuals who were on the run and about ensuring that they were cleared to return to the north. That was in fact what you had said. I unfortunately interrupted you at that stage, but would you like to continue to give us more details of, in particular, what you meant by an extremely unhealthy interest by officials in the Northern Ireland Office? Could you say at what rank, what level?
Well, I have to be very conscious, and this is public,
yes, obviously.
that many people who have been affected by the Troubles are listening. So I will be circumspect in some of what I say here. What I was referring to on that occasion was contact from within the Northern Ireland Office to Mr Sheridan's staff officer in respect of some quite high profile Sinn Féin members who were wanted, clearly wanted, and substantial evidence against them. So every few weeks.
But that was quite separate from on the run.
They were on the runs.
So these are senior Sinn
Féin
members who were on the run.
Yes.
Outside the jurisdiction of
outside the jurisdiction.
Tell us.
Well, Owen Carn, Rita O'Hare, are two that comes to mind. Two people who there is substantial, or was substantial, evidence to support a prosecution. And the messages I was getting from the ACC staff officer was, can you not get these people up a list? Can you not find a way to find them a way back to the jurisdiction?
So an ACC staff officer was putting, you felt, pressure on you?
No, I had the full support of Mr Sheridan.
Yes.
There was no political influence. The calls made absolutely no difference. But the point I think I was trying to make in the context was that the Northern Ireland Office had crossed the boundary between what is constitutionally correct. They should not be contacting police officers to put them under pressure. Mr Chairman, I will give you another example, only this is Downing Street on this occasion. Shortly after Operation Rapid was established, we identified two on the runs, a Vincent McInnesby and a Gerard McGill, who were both wanted for the attempted murder of Mr Brush in Ballygolly. They were arrested, I have a note here, on the 8th of March, sometime around tea time, and taken to the serious incident room, crime suite at Antrim. At 9:10 p.m, I received a phone call from the Duty ACC at headquarters. Jerry Adams had telephoned Downing Street demanding their release. Downing Street rang the Chief Constable's office looking their release, and I got a phone call suggesting that I should release them. That, of course, in my mind, is attempted to pervert the course of justice, and that was conveyed back to headquarters. But, well, I don't know who the personality in Downing Street was, but as a police officer, that is totally illegal and unconstitutional.
What did you do?
I refuse. Well, we continued interviewing them, and Mr. McGill was subsequently convicted and sentenced for attempted murder.
Ignored the...
Sorry, excuse me, order. With people interrupting, I don't think we can all hear the answer. Mr. Baxter, please, could you continue the story as you were telling it, please? Because
in answer to that, that's a subsidiary question. I ignored the telephone call.
Thank you.
Of course, I recorded it. But Mr McGill was successfully prosecuted. But I bring that to the attention of the committee simply to explain that in parallel to what we were conducting as ethical and within the law, there was a political process ongoing which was undermining police investigations. I give that one example. There are other examples which in public forum I'm not prepared to go into.
Okay. I've got a lot of people wanting to get in. I'll move it on and we'll come back to everybody as we can. David.
Thank you, Chairman. You're very welcome, Mr. Baxter. And what you've told us thus far has certainly been a revelation to us. Certainly very interesting. I would like to start off just by asking one simple question. I think maybe you've touched on it. On the confidentiality or the nature of all of this, what's your understanding of the confidential nature of the whole scheme? Who was supposed to know and who was not supposed to know?
It depends what you're speaking about, Mr. Simpson. If you're speaking about the operational review of wanted persons, it was quite openly known within the PSNI. And I understand that Mr. Sheridan briefed the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the Policing Board in a private session.
Can I just touch on that point? Probably we'll wait till Mr. Sheridan comes as regards the Policing Board, but we'll touch on that when he comes.
That's fine. So it was common, but if you're speaking about the Northern Ireland Office of Ministry,
correct,
absolutely no knowledge within the PSNI.
No
But the Northern Ireland Office, and I've spoken to several people, no one knew the NIO were sending letters.
Right.
No.
No one knew. No one knew within the PSNI that the NIO were sending these letters out.
Yes, and I have spoken to the former Chief Constable, and obviously you're going to speak to him. He will have his reply to that. The
Downey case itself, and it was raised in the debate last week in the House of Commons, in the debate that we had. You can answer this if you want, if you don't, and understand. The case itself and the letter that was produced to the judge, do you believe that letter, the outcome of the case would have been different had there not been political interference, i.e. from certain politicians giving evidence to that case, which would have maybe swayed the judge?
I think the best way I can answer that is that if Mr. Justice Sweeney had received full disclosure, particularly of the minutes of that meeting in 2006, that would have removed this idea of a catastrophic error, which there wasn't. And it is quite possible a different judgment, but it's difficult to answer. But certainly he was not in possession of all the facts. Yeah,
well, taking into consideration, Chairman, that you had said earlier, and I think Ian touched on it, that you or no one else were called to receive or for the courts to get extra evidence in relation to the judge had adjourned it.
Absolutely.
You yourself and others were not called in order to give that evidence.
Well, I think if you read the judgment and you see the extent of evidence that Mr. Hayne and Mr. Powell were provided the opportunity was giving, I personally felt that there was a deficiency on the prosecution side to respond to that and to explain. I mean, I think it's in one of the latter paragraphs where Mr. Justice Sweeney says there's unexplained answers. We were never given the opportunity to explain that we were operating a legal system within Northern Ireland, within what we were allowed to do, and that we were communicating with law officers, and that somewhere after that a political process interjected.
There's others to get in, so I'll probably come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Well, Mr. Baxter, thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. We're very grateful for you giving up your time. And what I'm about to ask you may be totally and utterly useless, and you may feel I'm an idiot, but there we go. When were you aware that the Northern Ireland office was receiving names from Sinn Féin? Did you learn that at the time when you were operating, or have you done that subsequently, later on, further down the line?
My recollection is that following a meeting with Mr. Sheridan in January, I understood that the solicitor was writing in with names. So the ACC's office were sending names to me. So I assumed they were coming from the solicitor. In fact, my team was briefed, it's in the judgment, that we would be carrying out an investigation to see if they wanted to respond to the solicitor. So I think in the judgment I realised it was the names were coming from Jerry Kelly rather than from the solicitor.
Okay. And did you at any stage look at the names and think to yourself, there's something very odd about this, in that these people seem all to come from the Sinn Féin side or the Republican Nationalist side, and actually why isn't it there aren't anybody from the Loyalist side being looked at in all of this? Did that ever occur to you?
No, it didn't, because the issue is, where would the Loyalists be on the run to?
Right. And to what extent did you feel at the time that you were being played with, and have you subsequently got to the view that you think you were being told only a certain amount of information?
No, I'm satisfied that within the briefing I got, that the government was receiving names from and the solicitor was involved. I think that was correct.
Right. Did you think to yourself at that time there was a political agenda being played?
Well, I certainly knew that in the collapse of the legislation, that this subject which had emerged was clearly an issue which had followed on from that, which is why I was very clear in my mind that there would be no political interference or direction in relation to on the runs or the review of these wanted people. We are a discipline, or police is a disciplined organisation. The request came from the Chief Constable, and I had the delegated responsibility and carried it out within the law.
And did you have a view as to why it was that the legislation collapsed?
Well, the legislation collapsed because first of all, I believe it was immoral. It was totally unhelpful to victims, and I would pursue terrorists to the end of the earth to put them in prison. And I think in a democratic society, everybody should be pursuing terrorists and criminals to put them in prison.
Thank you.
How many cases did he actually review?
I think in my period of time, somewhere in the region of 180.
Sorry, how many? 180?
180.
100.
In around that.
And how many of those 180 did you clear because there was a lack of evidence to prosecute?
I don't have those figures with me. I would say maybe 2/3.
2/3. So a third you deemed that there was still enough evidence to prosecute were they to come back into the realm of the United Kingdom?
On the date the reviews were conducted, but bear in mind that the Historic Inquiry team was conducting reviews of murders and new evidence may have emerged, which is why there was a caveat put to Mr Sheridan that should new intelligence or evidence which is continuity is preserved, that they're liable to arrest. These were not get out of jail cards. These were something that I struggled with in terms of wording, because I did not want to give anyone a piece of paper that give them any comfort. I know they're called comfort letters, but they, from my perspective, were only valuable on the day they were printed.
That's right. So on the day
sorry, I didn't send letters, but my recommendation to Sheridan was only relevant on the day it was made.
Yeah, so at the time you gave the recommendations, there was no evidence, enough evidence to carry out the prosecution. It might have come along later on, but there was nothing at that time.
Not prosecution, but to form reasonable grounds to suspect.
Yeah, yeah. And as you say...
And if I could refer you to that document, which goes through the various discussions as to why that was reached.
Yeah. And out of those people that you actually cleared, how many since then has new evidence come to light whereby there is grounds for prosecution?
I don't know. I retired in 2008. So
sorry. We can ask that elsewhere. And you said that the PSNI weren't aware of any letters going out?
No, they weren't aware that the Northern Ireland office were sending letters. My understanding is that the Attorney General was going to fulfil the Article 3 obligation by writing to people to tell them they weren't wanted.
Yeah. And would you say that this review that was being conducted was widely known?
It was known within the police service.
Yeah, but it wasn't a secret.
It's in the Ames Bradley report.
Yeah.
So it's what was secret was what was running in parallel with it.
Yeah. No, it just strikes me that I think there's 200 letters gone out that if these people were multi-killers and everything, if they were released in a population the size of Northern Ireland, which say is West Yorkshire, there'd be public uproar. So what you're saying is that you're quite happy to send these letters out because there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that they committed any crimes.
Well, we do live in a democracy which holds people to be innocent and proven guilty. But I'm not sure the point of your question. We under the arrangement the Chief Constable made with the Attorney General's office, reported to the Director of Public Prosecution whether we felt at that point in time there was sufficient intelligence or evidence to form reasonable grounds to arrest, which is a requirement under the Police Criminal Evidence Order and the 1984 Terrorism Act.
Yeah, and at a later date, after those letters had gone out, which obviously was done by a different agency, if there had been evidence found, then those letters would be null and void. So basically, the letters were just going out saying, we've got an out on you a minute.
You're right if the process had been followed, but you're wrong because the executive arm of the state, namely the government, sent the letters out. And I'm not a constitutional expert, and I'm pleased to see the committee has employed the services of constitutional experts.
Yeah.
But the difference, what happened was the government sending out the letter had a totally different illegal weight than if the police had sent the letter out, or the Attorney General.
Yeah.
Because one's a political promise and the other is a legal determination.
Yeah, but would the conclusion in the letters been any different if the police had sent them out?
Well, it was a different effect in my view in the court. Mr. Downey would not have, in my view, had the passage out of the trial in London. And if you read Mr. Justice Sweeney's judgment, it is a political promise which the government of the United Kingdom he felt should honour. Now, if it had been a law officer letter couched in the terms that if new evidence appears or intelligence you're liable to arrest, then we wouldn't be having this discussion today.
And in your opinion, and I'm not going to ask you to name anybody, did anybody receive a letter whom you feel or you felt there was evidence to at least take the case further?
I don't know.
Sorry?
I don't know because we didn't see any letters.
So you didn't know who was being written to?
No.
You didn't? No. Okay. Nigel.
The document you gave us last night on page 3 has a paragraph 3 at the top, which says this review will be conducted under terms of confidential reporting in order to prevent a misinterpretation of the purpose of this review. Who are you trying to keep it confidential from, and what misinterpretation were you fearing might be brought?
That's an internal classification. The documents will be classified as the review will be conducted under confidential heading.
And what misinterpretation were you fearing, perhaps that we were engaging in some process that we shouldn't be engaging in?
Well, it's extremely sensitive what we were doing, and misinterpretation in terms of, I suppose that we were trying to undermine the process of law. I'm quite truthful. I'm not sure what the ACC meant in that terms of reference.
I mean, the irony is that misinterpretation is now quite widely held on how this process ended up.
Well, absolutely, but there's also a comment, which is quoted in the judgment, about a press release that was drafted to be released in the event that there was some public knowledge of it, which said that we were conducting a review of persons. Well, I don't think you should read into that we were trying to hide it from the public.
Okay. Do you now feel, having seen the Downey judgment and all the political shenanigans that were going on, the history of promises made about the on the runs, do you feel perhaps you were duped a bit in this process, that what you were doing was part of something that was meant to be something more than a factual statement? I
feel disappointed for two reasons. One, I'm disappointed my government would do this, and I'm disappointed at the pain and suffering that this has caused to victims. My own professional view is that we carried this out in accordance with the direction of the Chief Constable within the law, but the spin-off effect of this has been horrendous to victims, and it has totally undermined confidence in justice.
And were you not surprised at the time that this work wasn't sent to the Historical Inquiries team, who were in existence by the time you were doing this work?
There are this is two different pieces of work. Crime Department are responsible for the management and maintenance of the computer system, which flags people as being wanted. The Historic Inquiry team, which is quite independent, from crime operations are responsible, or were responsible for the investigation of historic terrorist crime. So it sat in crime operations.
Just the reason for asking it is just this issue that's come up, that these forms of words that you were quite careful in devising said, we've got nothing on you today, but if we find something tomorrow, then you can still be prosecuted effectively. It just leaves the question, if the historical inquiries team go through the files and perhaps put two and two together, or find something that was always there but hadn't quite been realised, does that count as new evidence, which means, in your view, you could reactivate the prosecution, or does that count as stuff that's effectively been cleared up?
I think it would. It certainly would create new intelligence to have something like that.
Jack.
After devolution of policing and justice, were you aware to the degree to which the Minister for Justice had not been advised of the extent of this scheme?
I retired in November 2008.
Okay.
So,
okay.
So I have no knowledge.
You were on a slightly different tack then. You spoke about political interference from Whitehall from time to time when you apprehended or were in the process of investigating people who were suspected of pretty awful crimes. Could you give us an idea of how many occasions in your experience was there that political interference as far as calls made and pressure put to bear on you and your colleagues?
I think I would need some time to think about that, because there would be a number of occasions.
In your opinion, are they clearly illegal attempts to interfere with the judicial process?
I would say there was a culture within the Northern Ireland office to ensure that Republicans were not prosecuted.
And we will come back to you with perhaps another question to do with specific numbers. I think that would be some use to the committee.
Thank you, Joe.
Sorry if I might appear to duplicate something that you've referred to already, but as you'll appreciate, it's a very difficult subject, and we're covering a very, very wide range of things. And I realise that you left in 2008.
Yes.
Yeah. What I find quite extraordinary is the claim that the Minister for Justice was totally unaware of the scheme. And I wondered if you had an observation on that, whether you left before devolution of police and justice, But it seems remarkably strange to me, that there was no dialogue on such a, how should you say, a momentous thing. I'd just like your observations on that.
I'm afraid that would be outside my remit that I could comment on, because I had retired prior to 2010, and I think it's a matter of judgment around the interpretation of the Senior Civil Service Code. And I have no expertise in that.
Yeah, and in one of your replies earlier on, of course, one of the purposes of this sort of inquiry, if you like, is to try and establish who, when and what people acted ultra vires, Some of your earlier comments suggest to me it's not just a question of people acting ultra vires, it's also a question of abrogation of duty. Looked at it in your terms. Would you like to elaborate a bit further on that? Because that would be applicable to you.
Well, I would refer to in the judgment, a phone call from Mr. Sweeney to the ACC staff officer, querying whether the police had checked the PNC computer. That is a breach between the executive and the police. That is a political interference in policing. Is that a criminal offence? I suspect not. There is an offence of malfeasance in public office. It's just should not happen. So it's very, very hard to gauge what the motivation of the person. But in terms of the phone call from Downing Street seeking the release of a prisoner, that is certainly across the line in terms of interfering with investigations.
Okay, thank you, Alistair.
And thank you for your evidence and your information so far, Mr. Baxter.
You mentioned to us there earlier that you thought about 180 and we're not, give or take, one or two, and that 2/3 were cleared. But what I wanted to probe was, was your involvement post 2006, post the collapse of the on the run legislation, or was there something went before that?
Well, there clearly was something before that because of the meeting in June 2006, but I was unaware of that when I became involved in January 2007.
And the meeting in June 2006, remind us?
That was the meeting with the Home Office representative, the Attorney General, the PSNI, on the 9th of June 2006 to discuss an on the run case. So there clearly was some process ongoing, and we know from the judgment there was a process from 1999.
But that was after the collapse of the legislation in the early part of 2006.
Maybe, I'm not sure the date it collapsed.
Yeah, the collapse was February, March, sometime 2006, or withdrawn at that stage. What I was trying to establish was, does your Operation Rapid just start then, or is Operation Rapid go back to 2003, 2004?
No, Operation Rapid started, I think it's on the 7th of February 2007. And we were totally unaware of all of this background.
And, so are there cases then, are you aware of any cases pre-2006?
No. I don't know many that there would have been. But they're clearly aware from, in fact, because of the meeting on the 9th of June 2006.
And were these people who were eligible, were the only, I suppose it's not a question you can answer easily, but were these people only Sinn Féin endorsed people? Were there any others who were not Sinn Féin endorsed who were going through the system?
Well, reading the judgment, they seemed to be all Sinn Féin endorsed because seemed to have been given by Jerry Kelly. My understanding at the time was that Mr McGrory was writing in, and therefore they could have been INLA, they could have been anyone, other than loyalists, obviously.
Okay, Chair, for the moment, thank you.
I have a few just questions and clarifications. Obviously, when you refer to the Attorney General, because of the time, this was the UK Attorney General and not the Northern Ireland one, because it was prior to devolution.
And that's a key point, because it was a joint Attorney General. Yeah. So he had jurisdiction in London. Yeah. I just want to check something else. It was reported in the judgment that the administrative scheme came to halt in 2004. But Mr Downey's casework on that continued, obviously, because the letter was issued in 2007. Who would have been doing the checks if the PSNI weren't? You said Operation Rapid came around on the 7th of February 2007, is that correct? Yes.
So who were doing the checks on the wanted list prior to that? So in that period between 1999 and 2004, and indeed beyond 2004, who was involved in checking the wanted list at that point?
I don't know the answer to that, because I didn't know that was happening. Okay. Okay. There were also 10 cases, according to the Secretary of State, that were referred by the Prison Service in Northern Ireland for consideration, so that didn't come through Sinn Féin, and 4 that were referred by the Irish Government. That's in a written statement from the Secretary of State, I think last week. Do you have any insight as to how or why the Prison Service would be raising such requests with the police or indeed anyone else?
I have no idea why.
Okay. And were you aware that any cases had come through either the Irish Government or the Prison Service?
No, I wasn't onto the judgment.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned the fact that there was a press release, that it was referenced in the judgment obviously, but also you mentioned there was a press release prepared if it came into the public domain to explain what the scheme was about.
Yes.
Are we to take from that throughout the operation of the scheme it was meant not to be in the public domain?
No, the reason for that is simple, that in all policing operations there is a community impact assessment and there is a media policy to manage either misperceptions or correct perceptions, and that was simply standard.
Okay.
But this was all police work is confidential, and there are aspects of this which is confidential because evidence has emerged to support prosecutions. Mr. Chairman, if I could make clear that Operation Rabbit was not about closing cases. It was simply about looking at individuals, and as I pointed out earlier, at least 2 people were arrested within Operation Rabbit.
The other issue that you have raised was with respect to the basis on which you were able to advise that Mr. Downey was not wanted by the PSNI at that point in time in 2007, and that was on the basis that fingerprint evidence. That fingerprint evidence that is available now wasn't in his case then. Is that correct?
No, I can't confirm that.
Okay.
Because first of all, I don't have the files here, but I think it's a wider. There's wider issues, and indeed, if I could respond to a comment by the judge where he indicated that I got a file from Chief Inspector Graham and simply forwarded on to the ACC. I had, in fact, a 3-hour meeting with Chief Inspector Graham where we went through Mr. Downey's case. So it wasn't just a tabletop exercise, and I wouldn't confirm or unconfirm what evidence there is in that case.
Okay. But there was reference during the earlier part of the session to fingerprint evidence.
Yes, there was an issue there in respect of fingerprint which was missing.
Okay. Can I ask a question? When the fingerprint evidence became available or was rediscovered or whatever category it falls into, did anyone inform the Attorney General or indeed anyone else in 2008 that that was the case?
Well, reading the judgment, it seems not. But then, why would you?
Well,
why would the police tell the Attorney General to write to a suspect to jeopardise an inquiry?
Okay.
I mean, it's judicial madness.
Can I ask, in terms of the evidence you've given us today, you said that it would have been illegal for you to provide advice to the status of a person's, whether they were wanted or not by another police service in another jurisdiction, that it was out with your responsibilities.
Absolutely.
And that you had made that clear to the Attorney General?
It was in the June meeting of 2006.
Yes.
It was discussed and they accepted it was their role. It was an action point that they would carry out checks with the Metropolitan Police.
Okay.
The Metropolitan Police had the National Anti-Terrorist Squad and therefore would have had the database of wanted terrorists.
So it would be fair to say that there should be some record in the Attorney General's office, some paperwork that would record the fact that the PSNI were not in a position to make those checks or to pass that information on?
Well, I'm in possession of minutes of the meeting, which were not disclosed to Mr. Justice Sweeney and which the PSNI have kindly supplied today. So yes, I'm quite certain the Chief Constable will be able to supply the committee with that email.
And can I ask, were you surprised that those minutes were not passed to Mr. Justice Sweeney?
Well, having read paragraph 10, where the prosecution did not conduct a proper investigation, no, I'm not surprised.
Were you disappointed, perhaps, is a better question, that those minutes were not passed?
Well, the question then arises, what else has not been passed, and why was it not passed? Because Mr. McGinty is very clear in his evidence about what he did and did not do, but one thing he did not refer to was the meeting on the 9th of June 2006.
Can I ask a very direct question? Do you believe that the PSNI and you personally were being scapegoated for the failure of the case?
The answer to that is absolutely yes, and Mr. Chairman, if I could have the liberty to say that I thought the Secretary of State's statement was quite disgraceful in blaming the police without any due process, and I honestly think that she, by doing so, was covering up for what was going on with this administrative process.
I mean,
that's my personal view.
And I have to say that there are others of us who were also quite annoyed with the statement and the implication that this was in some way a devolved matter, which of course it never was. Can I also ask one other question? You've said that you did not link this was not, Operation Rapid was not linked to the HET. Did you find it strange that you were being asked questions about people who were potentially implicated in case files that would be being reviewed as part of a process within the HET, but you were being asked if you'd like to review them out of sequence? Did that seem a strange decision or a peculiar way to process the cases when, once the files had been processed by the HET, you would know whether or not there was sufficient evidence to pursue a prosecution at that time anyway, through the normal process agreed?
Well, that's a very valid point, but the difficulty is that when a citizen writes in, as I was told, he has a right to know if he's wanted or not. Therefore, at what point do you tell him he's not wanted? So Rapid did not reinvestigate cases, but simply looked at individuals. They accessed the files in the intelligence databases in relation to these people. But yes, there was a disjoint.
And can I ask another? It's final. It's a final.
Very
it's a final
because I have a
question.
number of other people, and we are over time. So quickly.
How many individuals, on average per year, write either directly or through their solicitor to the PSNI asking if they are wanted in connection with any crime?
This was the first time ever that I was aware of.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Although I would
And
say
Kate.
that there have been in other states in Europe.
Sylvia first, then Kate.
It's been fascinating and troubling, the evidence so far. Could I just ask you, Mr. Baxter, and I can only guess your reaction, but when the Downey judgment was published, the words catastrophic failure by the PSNI were repeated and repeated again. And your name is mentioned in the judgment, is mentioned repeatedly in the judgment as the person who headed up Operation Rapid. How did you feel at that stage? Could you describe the pressure to you, and could you also just reflect on the fact that the Chief Constable Matt Baggett said virtually immediately after the judgment was published that the PSNI accepted, and I'm quoting here, full responsibility for the failures. Was he wrong to do so?
Well, first of all, in respect of the judgment, I felt that the judge, of course, was quoting the prosecution.
Yes.
That was catastrophic judgment, which is a horrendous thing for a prosecutor to tell a judge that the prosecution case had a catastrophic mistake.
Yes.
And we'll have to question why he said that. And that leads on to other questions as to why he did not call certain witnesses. Such as Mr. Sheridan or myself.
Yes.
So there's that area of the conduct of the abusive process. In respect of Mr. Baggett, I mean, what do you want me to say? He was wrong. The judgment, I believe, was in possession of the police from the Friday before it was published. He had Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday and Tuesday. I never got a phone call. No one contacted me to ask what had happened, what was this about.
So no one from the PSNI, currently serving with the PSNI, contacted you following the publication of the judgment?
No, the first contact I had with the PSNI was yesterday. And Mr. Sheridan suggested I should take the initiative and recover some documents which I have shared with the committee. So Mr. Baggett reacted without knowledge. What more can I say other than I think it was poor leadership in that area?
Yes.
To give up his force as a sacrifice to cover for the Northern Ireland office.
So you feel, I mustn't put words into your mouth, but do you feel as if you've been hung out to dry in order to take the rap for this?
I would be afraid that people would try to hang me out to dry. I have confidence in this committee.
Yes.
One of the few things I have confidence in, but I do have confidence in this committee. I certainly have confidence in the chairman and the reputation of members of this committee. And I was delighted when the clerk contacted me last week to give me this opportunity to come, because the decisions in Up Rapid were taken within the law, they were correct. The Northern Ireland Office activities are something that you will have to look at. But at the end of the day, the victims and the people of Northern Ireland need to know that there is a robust prosecution process and that they can have confidence in justice. And I'm afraid this has totally undermined it.
Well, if I could just say to you and reflect, I'm sure on behalf of the committee, that in fact we were unanimous in deciding to call you as the first witness. And I'm very glad that we did so.
Okay, thank you. Kate.
Mr. Baxter, and your evidence has been very, very, very helpful indeed. I was going to actually, Lady Herman's covered a few of my points, because I just wanted to be clear that you were quite angry personally, and that many members of the PSNI be angry at the statement of the Secretary of State and indeed the statement of the Prime Minister about this being an error, catastrophic error. I think she used the word serious error, and she actually says the PSNI will wish to reflect on lessons learned from this case. How do you think the PSNI should be reflecting on lessons learned? I mean, what lessons are there to learn given your evidence?
Well, I wouldn't like to give advice to the Chief Constable now that I've retired, other than he should perhaps make some inquiries prior to proceeding down a culture of apology.
Well, of course, we will be seeing the Chief Constable, and I think your evidence is going to be very helpful. Have you been asked to see Lady Justice Hallett yet? Has she been in touch?
No.
So, do you expect to hear from her?
I would expect, but I haven't. Although others have been invited to give evidence.
What, other members of the PSNI?
Yes.
Do you know who?
I do, but I probably best not to.
Okay. But now, do you know if Mr. Sheridan? Well, we can ask Mr. Sheridan. But you would obviously be willing to see her.
I'm willing to see everyone. I'm seeing the Police Ombudsman next week. I've set aside a day because I think to reassure this committee, the independent overview of the processes needs to be conducted to give an audit of what happened from an independent policing point of view.
And just one final point, what do you actually think would make the public, both in Northern Ireland and in the rest of the UK, feel, what do you think needs to come out of an inquiry like this, Lady Justice Hallett's inquiry? What is it that people will need to actually feel we've got justice here for the victims in particular?
Well, if I could be frank, Mr. Chairman, the victims in Northern Ireland will never get justice.
Whatever happens?
No, because once the Sentencing Act was passed, which allowed prisoners to be released, and all these other schemes, justice in relation to Republican and loyalist terrorists has been totally corrupted. And it pains me to say that the victims are the casualties, the collateral damage of a policy started in 1988. And I don't want to be votive, but it's almost as if the blood of victims are crying out for justice, and there is no one to listen to them. And this process is just more evidence of it.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you, Chairman. And again, the evidence so far has been, to say the least, intriguing. A couple of brief questions. You mentioned, or it was your opinion rather, that you felt there was a culture within the NIO that no Republicans were to be prosecuted or words to that effect. Is that what you said, or can you clarify?
Yes, I think I think I could stand with that, and also that there was a culture to conceal Republican activity from the population.
That's useful. The other point is that wouldn't have come from some low-level civil servant. That sort of culture, the development of that culture would have had to come from someone senior within the NIO, such as Secretary of State or...
It's not for me to judge Mr. Hayne, but in reading his statement to Mr. Justice Sweeney, it's almost as if he displayed great glee in supporting a person who is suspected of murdering members of Her Majesty's forces.
Yeah. I think others were of that impression as well. The other point is, and some victims groups have raised this with me whenever the whole thing was out in the public domain, and we have the letters, and we have these royal pardons or royal prerogatives, and victims are saying, well, you know, these people who portrayed to hate the Brits were very happy to take royal pardons. From your perspective as a police officer, how do you see the royal pardons operating as regards evidence or crimes? What circumstances or what influence politically could have been used to achieve royal pardons, in your opinion?
I'm not sure I'd like to answer that, because I can answer it personally, but if I'm here as a police witness, I probably shouldn't answer that. Sorry, I don't want to.
Why not?
I have a personal view on that, but I'm not sure.
But why not? Why do you think you shouldn't answer it? Or we'll put it this way: do you believe personally, without maybe giving names, do you personally believe that the royal prerogative was used for senior members of the IRA or Sinn Féin?
I think if you look historically at the reasoning for royal prerogatives, it certainly wasn't for the purposes which the Northern Ireland Office used them. And I suppose when you look at what happened, they were used as an alternative for amnesty.
Thank you.
I think probably it could have to be the last question, Oliver.
Well, thank you for your candour and for being as honest as you have been during the course of this. I think it's most certainly very useful. I'm not a lawyer, and I've never had too much to do with the police, so I just want to understand the process which you would normally go through if it were not a case like this, which is very, very sensitive indeed. If you, as a policeman, were put in together, and you've got an enormous amount of experience as a policeman, so you understand how this operates, am I right in thinking what you would do is you would carry out your investigation, you would then put the case together, and you give that to the Crown Prosecution Service, who would then in turn would end up by going off and talking to the Attorney General and saying, this is the case which we feel we have got an opportunity to be able to prosecute, and we think that we've got a strong enough case in order to get a conviction. Is that the process which ends up by happening?
Yes, if it's an offence for which the Attorney General must give consent.
Right. Okay. That being the case, have you ever known a previous case where you have done all of that, you have put the information forward to the CPS, and then it's been taken right out of the hands of the CPS, and it's actually been the Northern Ireland Office which has got involved in the past? Have you ever known a similar case to that?
No.
Right, so this is a unique thing which we're looking at.
Although we're not probably speaking about the same thing, we were not presenting a prosecution case to the DPP. My understanding is that the report that Mr Sheridan sent to the DPP was to meet an Article 3 requirement,
right, that
a person is entitled to know if they are wanted. And I think there's a Greek human rights case where it held, first of all, the person had to be told, but secondly, it is the law officer of the state that informs them, which in this case is the Attorney General. Because it's a legal decision, not a political decision.
So, under normal circumstances, the CPS would have actually come to a conclusion, would have said, we cannot have this case because we don't think we've got a strong enough case in which to mount, yeah?
No, in these cases, the view was that we didn't have sufficient to arrest, or they weren't wanted in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
That then went to the DPP, which, as a department, should have been checking if there's outstanding warrants or extradition warrants. And then that form of word should have went to the Attorney General, who is the law officer of the state, independent of politics, who should have been writing to Mr McGrory, the solicitor.
Right.
And that, in my understanding, is the proper constitutional and legal process.
And that didn't happen because they just bypassed.
Yes, and what's quite shocking is that in Mr McGinty's evidence, he says it becomes so routine he didn't even check with the Attorney General, he just kept sending them over to the NIO.
Right. Well, thank you very, very much indeed for that.
Thank you. I'm not going to ask you to name them, but do you know who received the royal prerogatives?
Only what was reported in the local papers.
You don't have
during the Migo trial, there was some of them.
You don't have the private knowledge of it, no. Mr Baxter, you've been extremely helpful to us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr Chairman.